Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Lee, and for the opportunity to talk to you all about some of the work we're doing as part of the Transform project. As Lee mentioned, this is a joint presentation between me and Rob Dunn, who many of you met at the kickoff meeting. And to start with, I will introduce the recycled phosphorus fertiliser product we're working with, and then Rob's going to describe some of the research that we've done in the past, looking at how the fertiliser performs relative to conventional phosphorus fertilisers. And also, he'll introduce the demonstration site and some of the other work we're proposing to do as part of the project. So a few weeks ago, Torsten gave a really nice introduction in his presentation to some of the issues that surround phosphorus fertilisers. So I won't go into great detail about that, but I will briefly remind you of why it is so important that we use phosphorus fertilisers more efficiently and also find alternative sources for them. Did that slide move on okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so as you know, global food production is actually underpinned by phosphate fertiliser. And most of that phosphate fertiliser is primarily derived from rock phosphate. Now, we know that these reserves are finite, but how much actually exists is quite controversial, and some estimates range that we've got enough fertiliser or rock phosphate left to last just a few decades, whereas others predict we've got it to last for centuries. But either way you look at it, it is finite. But perhaps one of the bigger issues around it currently is not how much of it is left, but where it is. And we know that around 70% of the current reserves actually lie in just one country, and that's Morocco in Western Africa. And the next largest deposits are in China, which make up only 5% of the deposits. And they don't generally export much of their fertiliser anyway. So there's massive geopolitical risks around phosphate fertiliser supply. And back in 2009, Johan Rockström published a paper in Nature in which he identified 9 environmental planetary boundaries that we need to operate within in order to be sustainable. And biochemical flows was one of these, and originally there weren't actually thought to be any issues with regard to phosphorus in this context. But the nitrogen cycle was considered to be greatly disrupted and exceeding its planetary boundary. However, following a review by Stefan et al. in 2015, it also was recognised that the phosphorus cycle had also exceeded its planetary boundary. And this highlights the need to use phosphorus resources more responsibly and also more sustainably. And this slide is just to highlight that phosphate rock from which most of our phosphate fertiliser is derived has been considered as a critical raw material within the EU since 2014. So critical raw materials are raw materials of high importance to the EU economy, but also with a risk associated with their supply, which is illustrated by the earlier slide showing the uneven distribution. And if Morocco decided to stop exporting it, supply issues would be very large. The only significant reserves in the EU are found in Finland, and those mines are quite small. So within the EU, it's quite a serious potential geopolitical issue. So a little history lesson now about the origins of the phosphate fertiliser industry. I think what I've just mentioned sort of highlights the need to find alternative sources of phosphorus. But the very first commercial phosphate fertiliser was actually produced by this person on the right here. That's John Bennett Laws, who was actually the founder of Rothamsted Research. And he produced the first phosphate fertiliser in 1842, not from rock phosphate, but he realised that there's quite a lot of phosphorus in animals and in animal bones. So he dissolved animal bones in sulfuric acid and made the first superphosphate fertiliser. That actually represented the start of the inorganic or synthetic fertiliser industry, if you like. And in order to prove to people that his fertiliser worked, he started what are now known as the long-term experiments. And you can see a picture of one of them over on the right, started in 1843. And that was actually the foundation of Rothamsted Research. And if he hadn't dissolved those bones and created this superphosphate, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now, and either Rob. Rothamsted wouldn't exist as it does today. But interestingly, 181 years later on, the company that we've been working with, Elemental Limited, are doing something very similar. So they're using bones from the meat industry. So within the meat industry, animals are slaughtered and processed at abattoirs. And the first process of that is to produce primary meat or food products, which you can see at the top on the right there. But also you get a lot of leftover byproducts, which you can see sort of on the bottom on the right there as well. So what happens to these abattoir byproducts currently? Well, generally, most of it is transported to what are known as rendering plants, where it's processed and they try to recover more animal fat and meat stock. Non-food products are often sent to landfill, or if the oils that are recovered aren't of good enough quality for the food industry, they're quite often burnt as a source of bioenergy. But really, the burying the bones represents a real waste of potentially useful phosphorus. And the current practices involve a lot of transport and disposal costs. So I was hoping that Adrian was going to be able to give a presentation and join us today, but he's actually over in Ireland at one of the plants that are just being set up. And so he wasn't able to join us today, but he did send me a few slides, which I'll run through now, just explaining the process of production or the two stages of production, and a little bit about the company. So Elemental Limited, I think founded in about 2015, so they've been going a few years now. They developed a system for processing all abattoir byproducts. So through a combination of proprietary technical and chemical processes, they turn abattoir byproducts into value-added end products in a two-phase process. Now, the first phase of this process recovers high-quality beef proteins and fats for human consumption. In the second phase, they use the residual bone material and all the other organic wastes from the livestock. So that includes ears, udders, tails, hooves, every bit you can imagine, apart from the brain and the spinal cord. That's the only bits they can't incorporate because they're classed as category 1 waste products and have to be dealt with differently. But they take all of that and convert them into a sustainable, slow-release phosphate-rich fertiliser, which is also rich in carbon, also rich in sulphur, and can be made rich in micronutrients as well. Now, both these phases take place in purpose-built units at the abattoir, meaning none of the waste material has to be taken away from the abattoir. It produces high-quality food products because there's no degradation as processing is immediate. Almost no waste at all, and only products of value are actually transported from the abattoir. So the food extraction process uses the offcuts and the bones and bits that are left over, as you can see in the picture here. What it does is recover the high quality, fully traceable beef fat, beef proteins from the fresh bones and the meat trims. The process increases the fat and protein recovered from each animal compared to if it was carried out at a rendering plant, and this actually increases the value and yield for the meat producers. And here's an example of a couple of the food products that they recover. On the left there is high quality protein powders, which can be used in energy supplements and so on. And on the right there's beef broth for use in stocks and sauces, and that can actually be dried as well and used in a powdered form. But once they've done that, what you're left with is this cleaned, sterilized dry bone material. And this is what they actually use as the phosphate source for their fertilizer process. And this is their pilot plant, which is situated not too far from us. It's about 8 miles from us. And so if we hold a meeting here, hopefully we'd be able to go up and take a look and a walk around. Basically, what they do here is they take all the category 2 and 3 animal byproducts, which includes bones, inedible organic matter, and even the lairage or waste sludges, from the bedding that the animals are housed on. at the abattoir, and they're sterilised in an EU-approved high temperature and pressure process using what they've got their patented technology. So by this process, the insoluble bone phosphate is converted to a more soluble form of phosphate by adding acid. So very similar to what John Bennett-Laws did all those years ago. Now this is what it looks like once it's been neutralized, and that's done by adding ash or lime to the solution, because when it comes out of those tanks that you saw just now, it's got a pH of about 2, something like that. It's very acidic, but once it's neutralized, the process actually helps it dry as well. And at this stage, you can actually add any other nutrients that you want to. So they in the past, they used to add a variety of micronutrients to suit the local market demands, and they source them from a variety of sources that are all recycled. And this is what the fertilizer product looks like. It's dried and reformed into dense nutrient-rich granules, which can be used in conventional fertilizer spreading machinery, and it contains about 20% phosphate and can be blended with nitrogen and potassium or used as a straight phosphate fertilizer. So just a little bit about the potential market role for the fertilizer. In the UK, there's 2 million cattle slaughtered annually. Around the world, there's about 300 million. And from each animal, the stage 1 process recovers approximately 40 kilograms of edible fats and 8 kilograms of edible protein, which is actually the equivalent to about 42 kilograms of fresh meat. So quite a bit of added value. And from each animal, you can produce about 175 kilograms of fertilizer. That's because you add other products in as well, but that fertilizer is about a 20% phosphate fertilizer. If all of the animals that were slaughtered globally were processed in this way, you could probably produce about 50 million tons annually, and that equates to about 20% of the global fertilizer use. So potentially this could be an important product in the fertilizer market. But as always, there's the one big question is it as good as other phosphorus fertilizers? So I'm going to swap seats with Rob here, and he's going to carry on and tell you about some of the trials that we've done looking at the fertilizer.
Thank you, Martin, and hello everyone. We're all well today. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly talk about 3 trials that we've carried out with Adrian and Elemental. And they've all been, well, the ones that we've carried out at Northwick have all been inside controlled environment rooms. And one of the trials that I'm going to talk about was actually carried out in Africa. So the crops that we've grown are wheat, spring wheat, or a grass which is typically grown for consumption by cattle or sheep out in the fields, perennial ryegrass. And so this first trial that I'm going to talk about is just a comparison really of different types of fertilizers. The NPK is basically just what the farm uses. It's nitram, triple superphosphate, or muriate of potash. And then we compared that with a commercial slow release fertilizer, and also we had a nil addition control. So the 2 figures basically show the grain yield for the wheat and the total amount of grass biomass that's grown. And this is a published piece of work, published a few years ago now. But basically you can see that the fallow fertilizer was matched to its N, P and K content if it was deficient in any of those elements. And that's really only the nitrogen and the potassium in this case. So that we were adding an equal amount of those 3 macronutrients for each of the different types of fertilizer. And so you can see that the fallow performed just as well as the other 2 commercial fertilizers. And we added that in both the optimal, which is following government advice about the amount of nutrients that we should apply for wheat and for ryegrass, and also an extra amount just to see if there was any difference between the fertilizers if they were over applied, and there basically was no difference. The second trial that I'm going to show was just on wheat. And basically, we wanted to know, did the fertilizers fallow compared to the NPK fertilizer that we would get on the farm quite normally? Would they differ in how the plants grew if we applied increasing rates of fertilizer? Basically, the three figures show that the number of ears of the wheat, grain yield, and the straw weight in the early part of the figures, fallow and the NPK, don't differ from each other. So they're basically performing in the same way as each other. And it's only really at the high rates that you see a little bit of divergence. And we think that this might be things like sodium that's contained within the fallow, which is missing from the NPK. And at very high rates, it might become toxic. But at low rates or moderate rates, it's just a normal part of the addition of the fertilizers to the soil. And so what we hypothesized was that we'd have this humpback relationship where very low rates of fertilizers would be down and very high rates would be down, but then there'd be a peak somewhere in the middle. And we wanted to find out where that was. So yeah, so there was no difference really between the fallow and the NPK fertilizer at moderate or low rates of fertilizer additions. And the final piece of data, which is an unpublished piece, was carried out with some colleagues from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And they grew a couple of crops. This is just the maize yields, but they grew them in two different zones. And one of the things that's potentially important about crop growth in Africa is that the soils over there are very old compared to the soils that we've been using in our pot experiments or field trials here in Britain. And because they're so old, they're highly weathered. And it might be important to have not just the macronutrients, but also some of the micronutrients within your fertilizer. European soils, certainly where we are in southwest England, are relatively young with glaciation that happened 10,000 years ago, and the soils that have developed since then. But basically means that the soil isn't so removed from the bedrock that some of these micronutrients interchange between the bedrock and the soil, whereas African soils, which are millions of years old, and as I said, highly weathered, and they are quite distantly remote from the soil to the bedrock. So this exchange of micronutrients doesn't really happen there. So you can see that the fallow production on the far right of this table, the grain yield, is actually greater than it is for the NPK or the controllers than the nil input fertilizers. And we think that it's either because the slow release nature of the phosphorus fertilizer means that the phosphorus that's applied is available for longer, and the soil doesn't just absorb it straight away and therefore make it non-available to the plants that are growing, or that there are some micronutrients that are missing from the soil and they're being supplied by the fallow fertilizer and not by the NPK because they just don't contain it. So yeah, that's a piece of work that will hopefully get published and follow up on in the future. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the trial that we're going to carry out now. And we've been wanting, Martin and I, for a number of years to do a field trial with the fallow fertilizer. But it's all very well growing plants in controlled environment rooms, but if you're trying to convince a farmer that a new fertilizer is actually useful, then they're not really going to take much notice of pot trials. What they really want are field trials. And I would love to show you a picture of the plots all developed and growing crops, but we only just sowed these down last week. So you can see it's just a field that looks very bare at the moment. But yeah, we've sown in 4 crops, well, 3 crops, but 2 of them is a different variety. One is a spring wheat, one's spring oats, and they're both commercially valuable crops and should produce a larger cash return for the fertilizer application that you're paying and putting on. And then we're also going to grow a grass and white clover mix, and we're going to do either a single variety or multiple varieties of those 2 species. And again, we're going to do an NPK, and this time we'll add sulfur because we think that the sulfur rates will be too low in this field to grow a commercial arable crop. Fallow, topped up as required for things like nitrogen, potassium. It doesn't need topping up for phosphorus or sulfur. And we're also going to do cattle manure and then top that up as required to match the NPK and S that's going to be applied, and also a nil control. And there'll be 5 replicates of each of those treatments. So hopefully later in the year, we'll have some nice pictures of crops to be able to show you. As I say, we've only just started this field work. And one of the things that we're going to do is use an app, which is based on the fertiliser recommendations for the UK, to inform how much extra nutrients are required once the cattle manure has been applied. And the app that we're going to use has been developed by Rothamsted and Dutchy College down in Cornwall, down in the southwest of England. And it's called the Farm Crap app. And basically what you do is you tell the app what your previous crop was, which crop you're planning on growing, and then you can take pictures, and it compares the picture that you take into a library of pictures and matches as close as it can do the rate of application that you've made, and then determines how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium has been applied, and how much of that is available to the crops. Here's a slide that I just made a couple of years ago for a demonstration where we grew some maize, and you can see that the column on the right hand side that says still needed shows that there is a small amount of nitrogen required, but still requires some phosphorus and potassium, but doesn't need any more sulfur or magnesium. And it shows you basically how much you need to apply in your bagged fertilizers in order to get good crop growth. So we'll be using that also as part of the trial for Transform to try and encourage the use of organic material from farms. So it's not just using the bones after they come back from the abattoir, but also some of the organic waste material that the cows and the sheep are producing on a daily basis when they're housed in the winter. And so acknowledgements, I'm going to pass back to Martin to do this one.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, that's great. There are just a few people to acknowledge there. The guys at Elemental, they've helped us out quite a lot, and some of our colleagues and here, Tegan and Jane, and also Kwame at Cape Coast in Ghana as well. Okay, that's it. Thank you.